Microchips are in almost every electronic product. But there's a global shortage affecting cars, high-tech gadgets, and even fighter jets. So why are supplies so low? And could the race to make up the shortfall ignite political tensions? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. They're in our smartphones, computers, and cars, even appliances like coffee machines. Semiconductors are in almost every electronic item we use, but they're in short supply around the world. Taiwan is the dominant player with nearly 60% of the global market, but production has slowed because of measures to combat a surge in COVID-19 infections. The island's worst drought on record is also having an impact as the industry uses large amounts of water. The auto industry is one of the most affected. Car makers like Ford and General Motors have shut down factories, laid off workers, and cut production. One manufacturer has warned the disruption could lead until next year. The U.S., South Korea, and China are pumping money into their own industries to become more self-reliant. In March, Beijing waived taxes on imported semiconductor materials, but China's main chip maker is under U.S. sanctions for alleged ties to its military. The U.S. Senate recently approved $52 billion for America's semiconductor industry as part of a tech innovation bill.
As a percentage of GDP, we spend less than half as much as the Chinese Communist Party on basic research. We rely on foreign nations to supply critical technologies that we invented, like semiconductors. That sunny American optimism has flickered as well. The world is more competitive now than at any time since the end of the Second World War. If we do nothing, our days as the dominant superpower may be ending.
All right, let's bring in our guests. In Seoul, June Park, a political economist and an East Asia Voices Initiative Fellow at George Washington University. In New York City, Jim Anderson, CEO of SocialFlow, a tech company. And in Miami, Teufel Dreyer, professor of political science at the University of Miami and editor of Taiwan in the Era of Tsai Ing-Wen. A warm welcome to you all. June Park, let me start with you today. What is causing this shortage and why is the situation currently so dire?
The pandemic that has begun at the end of 2019 has basically altered the business planning cycles for many of the industries that we see in connection with the chip shortage. And the most vulnerable sector in this chip shortage crisis was the automotive sector, the automobile sector, because usually when the chips orders are sent in, the primary consideration was given to other products, such as the mobile phones or computers or any other equipment that we have used in order to get connected during the pandemic. So that's why we have the shortage at the moment.
June Teufel Dreyer, let me ask you, what is the overall impact of all of this? I'm talking about the impact on businesses and also on consumers and just folks who want to get, the latest smartphones.
Well, we may have to wait for a long time. And I know my grandsons are at the age where they think they will die if they don't have the latest in the electronic equipment. And they're just going to have to get on a waiting list. But if I may add something, and by the way, I've never been on a program before with another June, so pleased to sort of meet you. A lot of things are being blamed on the pandemic, and in truth, it did disrupt an awful lot of things. But I have to go with Mark Liu, who is the TSMC chairman, the guy who runs the day-to-day operations, because Morris Chang, the founder, although a very, very alert and hale and hearty 89-year-old, has withdrawn a bit. And he said something interesting. And he said, that it was only partially due to the pandemic, and but it was also due to manufacturers stockpiling chips, and that you have to distinguish between real demand and stockpiling for inventory. And he thinks a lot of this is because of stockpiling for inventory.
Jim, let me ask you, from your point of view, how long is it going to take for production to catch up with demand? There are some who suggest that this could take at the very least 2 years. Does that timeline sound about right to you, or do you think it could be even longer?
Yeah, I think 18 to 24 months is a good estimate. But as June said, June Teufel Dreyer, there could very well be some stockpiling here. Supply chains are increasingly interconnected around the world. Who knows what individual companies are stockpiling what? I suspect supply and demand as prices rise, that certainly changes the dynamics. You may be willing to wait for a game console if the price goes up on it. That has an impact. But certainly there needs to be more capacity, more supply, and 18 to 24 months, I think, is a good estimate for that.
June Park, the U.S., China, South Korea, they are giving incentives to try to ramp up local production. How are those efforts going thus far, and how long do you think that's going to take?
Well, as far as the Huawei ban is concerned, it is ongoing at the moment, and as much as the decoupling process continues in this regard, China is going to keep on trying to build this self-sufficiency within its domestic environment. South Korea and Taiwan are investing both in the US and in their homelands. South Korea has recently launched a K-chip belt cluster, which basically entails foreign companies such as DuPont and ASML participating, but at the same time, Samsung Electronics, basically SK Hynix, memory chips and NAND flash. Their focus is not just going to be on memory chips, but also on system chips. Taiwan, at the same time, is going to invest heavily within Taiwan while maintaining the leverage in the US by expanding production facilities. So we'll have to see how this unfolds into 2023 and into the longer term, maybe the next 10 years.
June Teufel Dreyer, let me ask you, Taiwan, we know, has almost 60% of the market when it comes to semiconductors. Is there any possibility that we could see Taiwan try to use this shortage of semiconductors as a political tool?
Well, Taiwan is very, very careful. The momentum recently, and I would say in the last 5 years, just because China has become so increasingly aggressive across the board. We don't have time to get into it here, I'm sure, but United Front work activities aimed at subverting the democratic process in a number of countries, and expansionist activities in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And they have really ramped up an anti-China coalition, which is still nascent, but this has benefited Taiwan, since people now see, instead of China saying, we deserve Taiwan, it's ours, or it ought to be ours, they're seeing a very aggressive China. And they're therefore becoming much more sympathetic to Taiwan. So in a way, Taiwan doesn't have to use this as a political tool. It's already got it. And you hear people in the publications saying, if China were to invade Taiwan, which it keeps threatening to do and is certainly making gestures in that direction, that would destroy Taiwan Semiconductors Manufacturing Corporation, and China would be the big loser as well. So in a way, Taiwan is in a good position in that sense. And it doesn't have to be overtly, look at what we've got and what you'll lose, because I think most of the world is already aware of what would be lost.
Jim, are there any viable or concrete short-term solutions that could help with this shortage?
Not to producing more chips, other than making sure your capacities are your factories are at capacity. If you can do overtime shifts, those kinds of things. So I'm sure those things are already being done as they try to boost production. But in terms of building new plants, if it's going to take you 18 to 24 months, it's a notoriously capital-intensive business. there are thousands of steps involved, and there's a significant amount of expertise and proprietary knowledge involved in developing these chips, which is how you end up with such a dominant company. They just did it better than others, and you ended up with a dominant market position. So I think probably the bigger issue will be the supply and demand. As prices rise, that will tend to reallocate chips. Not entirely, because you do have some stockpiling, but that will tend to reallocate chips to the highest value uses. And you may very well just end up waiting more for game consoles or phone upgrades or those kinds of things, which is not a trivial issue. It has an economic impact, but certainly doesn't seem to, at least as currently structured, rise to a national security issue.
June Park, I saw you nodding along to some of what Jim was saying there. Did you want to jump in and expand on the point that he was making?
Well, some of the dynamics between South Korea and Japan have not been resolved. And I think in connection with what Jim was mentioning, the export curbs that began 2 years ago by Japan on some of the crucial components of semiconductor production against South Korea really reveals that the US and Japan are hoping to benefit from this decoupling process. And there is a geopolitical dynamic in this, because either you belong in this supply chain or you don't. So that will accelerate the geopolitical divide into the coming years. And the export curbs are not ended. The Huawei ban is still in place. We'll have to see not just the economic dimensions of this, but the geopolitical dimensions as well.
June Teufel, Dreyer, of course, June Park there was talking about the acceleration of the geopolitical divide, and that leads me to something I wanted to ask you, which is, could this race to make up for the shortfall ignite political tensions?
I'm not sure, because the Chinese government, of course, is the reason for most of these political tensions. Things were going fine until the Chinese began to use computer chips and rare earths and all kinds of things as economic weapons. So I think the geopolitical tensions are already there. And I don't think they're going to get any worse because of this. But, Taiwan has the money. Morris Chang is I don't know who's the richest person in the world, but he's certainly up there. Not him personally, but his corporation does have the money, and Taiwan does have the talent. I remember when I was in college, the top of the class at MIT was always Taiwanese. There were half a dozen Taiwanese in the top 10, and they've still got the talent, they've got the money, and they've got the geopolitical impetus. If we don't stay ahead on this, we could be obliterated. So I think the geopolitical cards are still in play, and they're not going to get any worse. But on the other hand, they're not going to get any better.
Jim, if we're talking about, the geopolitical cards in play right now, from your perspective, how is this race playing out between countries for technological supremacy, for technological independence, especially when it comes to semiconductors?
Yeah, this is just one piece on the chessboard, if you will, and it's an important piece. I mean, technology has become such an important part of our lives, and in many ways, economic security is national security. But the thing I can't help but think is, wow, 2 years to sort of correct an imbalance in supply of chips, that's an incredibly short time as it relates to geopolitics. We're talking about things that unfold over decades as it relates to, say, the U.S.-China relationship. And I think there is bound to be an oversupply, say, 24 months down the road. When you end up with a shortage of things and everybody rushes in, especially if there's a lot of government money at stake to correct a supply imbalance, what happens? It whipsaws to the other side. And people who study supply chains for a living have a saying for this. It's called the bullwhip effect, which means, you overcorrect the other way. So I have a sneaking suspicion that 24 months from now, we'll be having a conversation about a massive oversupply of semiconductors and depressed prices and the problems that result from that. So how that plays out geopolitically, we'll have to see, especially as it relates to China. But it's a pretty short-term issue as it relates to the geopolitics.
June Park, when it comes to making more chips and countries ramping up production, I mean, the reality really is that, it is still going to take time. But even when it does happen, when orders are placed, it could still take several more months for those all to be delivered, right?
That's correct. And say, for example, when Samsung decides to build a factory with the $17 billion pledge that it made during the US-ROK summit in May, or when Taiwan finally expands the foundries within the United States, they have pledged six different places, including Arizona. When these foundries have been completed, it would take time until the completion, but when they are completed, you would imagine a different scale of production within the United States. With the Huawei ban or not, we are expecting to see a huge production amount coming from the United States. Plus, with the innovation drive that the U.S. is pledging for itself, I think there would be a huge change. A significant change upon the landscape of semiconductor industry. Then what would be interesting to see is how Europe responds to this. The contactless economy will accelerate even during or post-pandemic, during the post-pandemic periods. The need, the demand for chips is not going away. It would only be expanded, and the digital economy will continue to expand as well.
June Teufel Dreyer, in your previous answer, you mentioned rare earth elements, and I wanted to bring that up because you wrote a piece last year analyzing China's monopoly on rare earth elements. So I wanted to ask you, how does that play into all the semiconductor industry concerns over shortages going forward?
Well, it plays into China's whole of government and whole of society attack on problems, and it's a very, very well coordinated one. No matter whether you are pro-China or anti-China or just meh China, you have to admit they have played their hand brilliantly. Now, rare earths are not a major component of semiconductor chips. They are mostly silicon, hence Silicon Valley, and germanium, which is not a rare earth. So, but the same kinds of techniques are seen when China decides to do something. It decides to do it in a very coordinated way. And this is certainly a very coordinated way. And the problem with democracies in general, and this is a bigger problem for the EU because they've got so many democracies with different interests, is coordination. I have been told that a foundry costs between $10 billion and $12 billion to make, depending on what you want, what kind of chip you want to produce, and that after you make it, it's going to take at least 5 years to become profitable. So, in other words, government support is necessary. Now, China has the type of government that is willing to support that. Joe Biden says he's willing to support that. It's harder, obviously, because of the way our economy is structured with a lot of private input. And in the case of the EU, really, really hard, because even though the French and the Germans and the British, which of course aren't in the EU anymore, pretend to be very friendly, the national rivalries are still there.
June Park, I saw you reacting to some of what June Teufel Dreyer was saying, so I wanted to get your reaction. But I also wanted to ask you about, is there a lot of worry, is there a lot of concern that China's hold on rare earth elements sector is so strong that it could be used against everyone else?
For the rare earth elements, I would think that there have been previous cases in the WTO for China because China withheld them when there was a clash between Japan and China over the Senkaku Diary Islands. And that kind of precedent leads me to believe that in subsequent years, when the global supply chains are much more politicized than now, there is a high possibility that currently the 100-day supply chain review does list rare earths as one of the elements that the U.S. is very much going to be fixated on into the coming years, but it's not really exercised as a ban at the moment, as in the form of, say, a Huawei ban. So we would likely see some kind of a policy mechanism to sort of secure some of the rare earth elements, especially coming from Africa, because China already possesses a huge sum of the rare earths that is discoverable in Africa. So there may be infighting amongst countries that would be in need of the rare earths.
Jim, this dependency on Taiwan when it comes to semiconductors, how worrying is that to Western countries?
I think it's really worrying. I mean, when you talk about semiconductors and technology in general, having that kind of dependency, especially in a place where China clearly has ambitions, I think that elevates the concern. Again, from a geopolitical perspective, as we were talking about before, I think you think in terms of decades, not 1 or 2 years, but it's just illustrative of the kinds of dynamics that can play out and the importance of these technology issues, especially in a sector where you're talking about $10 to $12 billion. I mean, that's a government level investment. It's very difficult for private companies to make $10 to $12 billion investments with a 5-year payback, as June was talking about, without some form of government subsidy. And as she very well stated, I mean, in a democracy, it's very hard to do that compared to a more authoritarian state. So I think there's a pretty high degree of concern in general about this kind of dependency. Again, I'm not sure the acute concern is there. I've not heard anybody talking about we're not going to be able to get the kind of military hardware we need, or there's going to be a giant economic impact. It's more, it's going to take you longer to get your cell phone. It's going to take you longer to get your PlayStation, which is a concern, but it's more about where it could go than where it is today.
June, Teufel, Dreyer, in terms of competition, how far ahead are the Taiwanese?
Several years and making steady progress. They're not sitting on their laurels at all. They've got some amazing talent. They've got a very efficient educational system, and you don't have to persuade. It's not like the United States where we almost have to bribe students into STEM study programs. They're eager and willing, and so I think they understand critically that this is important to their future as an independent sovereign state. So I think they are going to be able to maintain that momentum. Now, there have been problems. A Taiwan company, Micron, an employee there was found guilty of selling secrets to China. These high-tech silicon chip secrets to China. So it's not perfect, but they've got the momentum and they've got the will to stay ahead. So I think they probably will.
June Park, aside from everything else we've discussed during the program today, I want to talk to you for a moment about specifically the COVID-19 outbreak in Taiwan. Did that further disrupt the semiconductor industry, and how much concern is there that could really make things much worse, at least in the short term?
I think within Taiwan, there may be increased cases compared to the previous months that Taiwan has experienced. But Taiwan has had quite a modeled sort of a good example case of the COVID-19 pandemic recovery process. And I think that with vaccination provided by the United States, Taiwan received Moderna vaccines, and within several months, I think Taiwan would be able to recover from its current phase and possibly into a more rapid pace into recovery.
All right, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thank you so much to all of our guests, June Park, Jim Anderson, and June Teufel Dreyer. And thank you too for watching. You can see this and all of our previous programs again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.